At the old clock tower, secrets linger, and death waits in the shadows. Welcome to Silent Casebook. I am your host, Sterling. Where are you watching from tonight? Drop it in the comments. I always love reading them. Now let's enter the mystery. The river town of Saint-Aubin had a way of hiding its own existence. Tucked between the slow bend of the water and the low hills beyond the fields, it was the kind of place where the same shutters opened and closed every day, and the same footsteps passed over the same cobblestones at the same hours. People rarely spoke of news unless it concerned the weather or a neighbor's health. Life, for most, was a careful routine of repetition. On a damp Wednesday evening, that rhythm broke. The rain had started after dusk, a mist at first, then a steady drizzle that made the river look like hammered pewter. Down at the square the lamps had already been lit, their pale halos shimmering against the wet stone. At the far end, the clock tower rose above the rooftops, its old bells silent except for the scheduled tolling of the hour. No one looked up at it anymore. It had been part of the town longer than memory. People joked that the tower aged but never changed, like the mayor or the priest. That night, the bell rang late. It was only a few minutes, but the delay was noticed. The sound that followed seemed heavier than usual, as if the metal carried some private burden. A dog barked once, then went quiet. By the time a boy from the bakery ran into the square shouting, the drizzle had thinned to mist. 2 men from the cafe went first, then more followed. At the foot of the tower, in the thin spill of lamplight, lay the body of Henri Chavot. Chavot had been the town's watchmaker for 40 years. He had lived alone above his shop, a short walk from the square, and he was the only person allowed to tend the clock tower's gears. People had seen him climb the narrow stairwell every week, with the same cautious steps, winding the mechanism, oiling the parts no one else understood. He was a small, stiff man, his shoulders rounded as if from years of leaning into his work. He drank 1 glass of red wine every evening at the cafe and never stayed past sunset. The body was discovered on its back, arms at odd angles, one hand still curled. His cap lay a short distance away, soaked through. For a moment, no one spoke. Then a muttered, almost relieved voice said, "A fall." Must have slipped. It was enough to give the others a frame. The men from the cafe nodded. A woman crossed herself and muttered that the rain made the stones treacherous. They told the boy to fetch the gendarme, though no one expected anything more than a formal report. Lucien d'Harcourt was not part of the town. He had arrived a week earlier, renting a small room above the baker's house. Officially, he was there for the fishing, though in truth he liked towns like Saint-Aubin, quiet, slow places where he could walk without anyone asking questions. A retired police inspector, he had grown used to listening more than speaking, and in retirement he found himself listening still. Even without intention, he noticed things, the way people's eyes lingered or darted away, the small inconsistencies in their stories, the energy that filled the space between words. He had been standing under the awning of the cafe, watching the rain when the boy came running. He followed the others to the square but kept to the edge of the group. He looked at the body. Something about the scene was ordinary in the way misfortune is often ordinary. A wet street, a man who had lost his balance, the randomness of timing. And yet as Lucien watched the townspeople cluster and whisper, he sensed a tension under their movements. They did not rush to check the body or to comfort one another. They stood like people at a distance from their own guilt, not quite grieving, not quite surprised. The gendarme arrived after a quarter hour, a round-faced man with a tired moustache. He crouched by the body, glanced at the slick stones and shook his head. "A bad fall?" he said, to no one in particular. this rain. A cart was fetched to carry Chavot to the undertaker. The group dispersed in small, uneven clumps, boots splashing on the wet street. Someone said the funeral would be quick. The man had no family here. Lucien stayed until the square emptied. The lamplight reflected in the puddles, stretching the tower's silhouette into a distorted shape. He turned and walked toward the river, his coat collar pulled high. At the next morning, the town resumed its rhythm, but the rhythm felt altered. Lucien sat at his usual table in the café, a seat that allowed him to watch the street through the rain-streaked window. He saw the baker's boy sweeping water toward the gutter, his motions slow, distracted. Across the square, the shutters of the watchmaker's shop were closed. A single black ribbon hung on the doorframe, limp in the damp air. The conversation inside the café was muted, almost forced. "They'll bury him tomorrow," said a man in a cap. "No family to wait for." "A pity," said the grocer's wife. "He was precise." No one said kind. Lucien stirred his coffee and let the words settle into the air. He had no intention of getting involved, that life was behind him. Still he watched the faces. They were not grief-stricken. They were measured. There was no mourning in their posture, only the stiffness of people holding something back. A figure passed the window. Madame Lenoir, the widow who lived near the river. She paused under the eaves, staring at the clock tower for a long moment before hurrying on. Her face, usually composed, seemed oddly pale. Lucien filed it away without thinking. He knew this pattern. The first day after a sudden death in a small town was not about loss but about adjustment. People rehearsed the story they would all agree to, even if only silently. This time, the story was simple. A fall, a wet stone, a man whose back had grown too stiff for stairs. Yet when Lucien returned to his rented room, the rhythm of the bell that evening felt different. It struck the hour softly, then echoed down the river. He found himself listening longer than usual, as though waiting for the sound to tell him something it couldn't quite say. Saint-Aubin had returned to normal, at least on the surface. But in the pause after the bell, Lucien heard the first faint note of disruption, the kind of quiet that always carried a secret. The rain stopped by mid-morning, leaving the cobblestones slick and dark, the river swollen with a dull, steady flow. From the window of his rented room above the bakery, Lucien d'Harcourt watched a pair of women walking toward the square, skirts held slightly above their ankles to avoid the damp. Their voices carried faintly in the still air, broken by pauses that said more than their words. He had no intention of investigating anything. He had told himself this twice over breakfast. He was a visitor, a man retired from the old work, free to enjoy quiet walks and warm coffee. He had come to Saint-Aubin to escape the pull of other people's secrets, and yet his eyes followed the women until they disappeared near the clock tower. The square seemed smaller in the clear daylight. The black ribbon still hung on the watchmaker's shop, its edges frayed by last night's wind. A single wreath leaned against the door. Across the street, a man on a ladder scraped mud from the eaves, pausing now and then to glance toward the tower, as though half expecting something to happen. Lucien left his room and crossed the square slowly. His shoes made soft sounds on the damp stone. He kept his hands in his coat pockets, and his expression unreadable. He passed the watchmaker's shop without stopping, then turned toward the river path, where the smell of wet earth and leaves lingered. Near the bend, he saw Madame Lenoir again. She was kneeling near the edge of the embankment, adjusting the position of a flower pot on her narrow balcony. Her hands moved carefully, but her face was distant, as if she was listening for something behind her own thoughts. "Good morning, madame," Lucien said gently, tipping his head. She startled a little, then smiled thinly. "Ah, good morning, Monsieur d'Harcourt." Her voice carried a hesitation, as though the words had been retrieved from somewhere far off. "A fine day after the rain," he said. Yes, better than last night." She looked toward the square, though the tower itself was hidden from view. A terrible thing, that fall. Henri was careful, always careful. Lucien let the pause stretch, watching her adjust the flower pot again, though it was already straight. "Slippery stones," he said finally. "Even careful men misstep." Madame Lenoir's lips tightened. She gave a small nod, but her eyes had moved away toward the river. He sensed she would rather end the conversation than continue it, so he tipped his head politely and walked on. By midday, the town was awake in its usual pattern. The butcher had set his cart outside. The grocer's door stood open, letting the smell of onions and damp wood drift into the street. A boy chased a hoop along the far wall of the square, careful to keep his distance from the black ribboned shop. Lucien stopped at the cafe for lunch. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of boiled meat and coffee grounds. The usual 4 men sat near the stove, playing cards in silence. The grocer's wife leaned on the counter, speaking quietly to the owner. "It's late in the evening," she was saying. "And no one saw him on the stairs?" "He never climbed after dark," the cafe owner said. "Never. He said the gears sounded different at night." Lucien took a seat near the window. He ordered a simple plate and pretended to watch the boy with the hoop outside. "He was up there," the grocer's wife continued. "And then, well, you know." The cafe owner shrugged. "An accident." The gendarmes said as much. The card players said nothing, but one of them, a heavy man with red knuckles, shifted in his chair. His eyes flicked toward the conversation, then down to his cards. Lucien watched the small motion and stored it away like a pebble in his pocket. When the food arrived, he ate slowly. He could feel the weight of the town's mood pressing into the cafe's walls. No one was wailing, no one was panicked. Instead, there was a restrained stiffness, as if the entire square had inhaled and forgotten how to exhale. After lunch, Lucien took his usual walk along the river. He greeted the postman, who carried a small bundle of letters. The man slowed only briefly to say, "Funeral tomorrow." Quick, like the others. He said it with the flatness of someone who had seen quick funerals before. By evening, the clouds returned in thin streaks, streaked with the color of ash. Lucien sat at the window of his room, watching the reflection of the clock tower in the river. The bell rang the hour, its tone carrying a different weight now, or perhaps he was only listening more closely. He thought of Madame. Lenoir's pause, the grocer's wife's voice, the heavy man's shifting in his chair. None of it was evidence. It was only texture, the kind of human fabric he had spent a lifetime reading. He felt the faintest stirrings of curiosity, the old kind he had promised to leave behind. Saint-Aubin was quiet again, but the quiet had changed. It no longer felt like rest. It felt like the stillness in a room where someone had just left, and everyone else was pretending not to notice. Lucien leaned back, letting the sound of the river fill the edges of the room. He had not meant to involve himself, and he still wasn't sure he would. But already the town was speaking to him, not with words, but with its silences. The next morning broke with a thin fog over Saint-Aubin. From his window, Lucien watched the mist rise from the river, clinging to the low rooftops. The clock tower stood like a pale ghost against the grey, its bell silent for the first time since the death. He dressed slowly and went down to the bakery. The smell of warm bread softened the edges of the morning. Behind the counter, the baker's daughter served him without a word, her eyes avoiding his as she slid a small loaf across the counter. He noticed the faint red beneath her eyelids. She had been crying, though not recently. "Thank you," he said softly. She nodded but didn't smile. Someone in the back room knocked against a pan, and she flinched. Lucien stepped outside with his loaf, tearing off a small piece as he crossed the square. The mist curled around his shoes. The black ribbon still hung limp on the watchmaker's door, damp from the night. A single candle flickered faintly in the window. He didn't go inside. He stood across the street, chewing his bread slowly, letting the square speak in its quiet way. No one lingered. Even the cat that usually sat on the grocer's step was gone. He spent part of the morning walking the narrow lanes behind the main street, where small gardens clung to the edges of the houses. Here, the mist thinned enough to see the first laundry lines of the day, sheets and blouses hanging limp in the wet air. Around the corner, he found Etienne Morel sitting on a wooden stool outside his workshop, smoking a short pipe. The man was in his late 50s with a broad back and hands like rough leather. He had been the watchmaker's only real companion in town, if gossip was to be believed. "Morning, Monsieur Morel," Lucien said, stopping a respectful distance away. Morel looked up, his face set in a careful neutrality. "Morning." Lucien gestured toward the shop with the black ribbon, though it was hidden from this alley. "Quiet today," Morel grunted. He tapped the pipe against his boot and leaned back against the doorframe. "Quiet yesterday, too. Quiet doesn't change much here." Lucien let the words settle. Morel stared at the ground, then at the pipe, then at Lucien again. His eyes had that restless flicker of someone weighing how much to say. "You knew him well?" Lucien asked gently. "Long enough." Morel's jaw tightened. "He fixed the small clocks, I fixed the big ones. Church bell, tower gears, anything that needed a ladder." Lucien nodded. "Then you must know if he ever climbed at night." Morel hesitated. His shoulders shifted under his heavy shirt. "Not often. He didn't like the dark up there. Said it felt different at night." He shrugged. "I suppose everyone has a weakness." The man's voice softened at the last word, carrying a trace of something like pity or regret. Lucien thought better than to push further. He only nodded again, then said, quietly, "A shame." Morel's lips pressed together. He went back to his pipe, the conversation floating into silence. In the afternoon, Lucien took his habitual seat at the café. The card players were there again, the same 4 men, but today they played more slowly, speaking in half-sentences that died before reaching the air. He ordered coffee and listened. Across the room, the grocer's wife was whispering with another woman. Words drifted over in fragments. He was angry. Not the first time. But he never said anything to her, and just stared, like he knew. Lucien stirred his coffee, careful not to make a sound. He had learned long ago that in small towns, truth travelled on half-heard whispers and unfinished sentences. When he left the café, the sun had begun to break through the mist, and a pale light touched the river. He decided to walk the long way back to his room, passing by the row of narrow houses on the eastern edge of town. It was there he saw a figure in a doorway, Mademoiselle Céline, the watchmaker's niece. She was in her early 20s, thin as a reed, with dark hair pinned carelessly at the back of her head. She leaned against the frame with her arms crossed, staring at the ground. Lucien lifted his hat slightly. "Mademoiselle." She looked up, her expression tightening, as if bracing for an unwelcome question. "Monsieur." "Please accept my condolences," he said. Her lips moved, but no sound came at first. Then she whispered, "Thank you." He was about to continue walking, but something in her posture stopped him, the way her shoulders curled inward, as if she were holding a weight no one else could see. "You must have been close to your uncle," he said softly. Her gaze dropped to her shoes. "Close? I lived with him. But he—" She hesitated, then shook her head. "He was a difficult man, not unkind, just difficult." Lucien said nothing. He had learned that silence was often more generous than questions. He didn't like to be surprised," she continued, her voice trembling. "If I came home late, he would sit in the dark and just watch, not say a word. I think he hated the idea that anyone could slip past him." She gave a nervous laugh, then covered her mouth quickly as if ashamed. Lucien watched her closely. Her fingers worried the fabric of her skirt, twisting and untwisting. Behind her, the hallway of the house was dim, the kind of dim that felt deliberate, as if the curtains were drawn tighter than necessary. "I suppose you'll be busy now with the arrangements?" Lucien said at last. She nodded. "Yes, the priest came this morning. People will come tonight. To look, to whisper. They'll pretend they cared." Her words came out sharper than she intended. She glanced up at him, almost apologetic. "I didn't mean—" He shook his head gently. "You've had a shock. It's natural." A small shiver ran through her, though the air was no longer cold. Lucien offered a polite nod and stepped away, leaving her in the doorway with her shadows. At evening, Lucien returned to his room above the bakery. He placed his hat on the chair and leaned against the window frame, watching the last of the mist dissolve over the river. In the square below, the candle in the watchmaker's window flickered again, just as it had the night before. He thought of Madame Lenoir with her flower pots, of Etienne Morel with his careful pipe, of Céline twisting her skirt in the doorway. 3 small gestures, each carrying a weight that words would never admit. The town was beginning to peel back its first layer of quiet. Not with confessions, but with the tremor of private shadows brushing against the edges of daily life. Lucien felt that old, reluctant pull again, not of duty, but of understanding. He knew, in a way he couldn't explain, that the clock tower's secret wasn't just in the fall or the bell. It was in the pauses, the silences, and the way people stood in doorways when they thought no one was watching. By the next day, Saint-Aubin was returning, in its awkward way, to the rhythm of ordinary life. The grocer opened his shutters. A single child kicked a stone along the edge of the square. Life persisted, but the air felt tentative, as if the town held its breath. Lucien rose before the bakery had fully warmed and walked the empty streets. A pale sun filtered through the mist, showing the fine cracks in the cobblestones and the thin trail of damp left by a cart's wheels. He passed the watchmaker's shop again. The black ribbon was still pinned to the door, its edges fraying in the wind. He noticed the candle in the window had burned low, almost gone, leaving a halo of melted wax around its base. He imagined Céline alone inside, tidying things she did not wish to touch, moving through rooms that had suddenly become foreign. By mid-morning, Lucien sat at his usual corner in the café. A weak smell of boiled coffee and damp wool lingered in the air. The café was more crowded than usual. Death had given the villagers a reason to gather without naming it. Madame Girard, the innkeeper's wife, was at the table across from him, her hands wrapped tightly around a cup she wasn't drinking from. Next to her sat Monsieur Barreau, the retired schoolteacher, his spectacles fogged slightly from the steam. "You heard what they're saying," Madame Girard whispered, not so low that Lucien couldn't hear. Barry adjusted his glasses. "I've heard plenty. None of it the same. They say he fell because of the bell rope, that it snapped." She leaned forward, eyes bright with the excitement of sharing what frightened her. "But ropes don't snap for no reason. Someone must have cut it." Barrett's mouth twitched in a half-smile, half-frown. "People see ghosts where there are none. He was an old man climbing a tower at night. That's enough to make a man fall." Lucien stirred his coffee and said nothing. Their words floated in the space between them like smoke. In the afternoon, Lucien made his way to the watchmaker's house. He knocked lightly and waited. After a long pause, the door creaked open, and Céline appeared. Her face was pale, her dark hair slightly dishevelled. "Ah, Monsieur Lucien," she said, her voice thin. "I wasn't expecting anyone." "I won't stay long," he said gently. "I wanted to pay my respects. Properly." She hesitated, then opened the door wider. "Come in, then." The house smelled faintly of oil and dust, with a sharper note of metal from the tools in the adjoining workshop. Lucien stepped inside, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. Curtains were drawn halfway, leaving the rooms in a half-shadow that seemed to press against the walls. They walked to the small sitting room. A single chair had been moved near the window facing the street. Lucien noticed the cushion was slightly indented, as if someone had sat there for hours in silent watch. Céline sat stiffly on the edge of a sofa. She held her hands together so tightly her knuckles had turned white. "Have people been visiting?" Lucien asked softly. She nodded. "Yes. They come, they look, they say they're sorry, and then they leave. They all seem different now. Like they're pretending to be kind, but what they really want is to see the room where he last spoke, the tools he last touched." Her words faltered, and she stared at the floor. "He was particular, wasn't he?" Lucien said after a moment. Her lips trembled slightly. "Particular? Yes. He liked things in their place. He hated surprises. You mentioned that before." She nodded quickly, as if she regretted speaking at all. I only meant he didn't like things to change. He had a routine. Breakfast at the same time, the tower visits, the evening candle in the window." Her eyes flicked to the corner where a small wooden table stood. On it lay a single photograph of the old man, stiff in his Sunday coat. Next to it, a brass pocket watch glinted in the muted light. Lucien let the silence linger. He had learned that in silence people revealed more than in questions. Finally, Céline whispered, "I keep hearing the rope in my head, the way they said it snapped, but I know he wouldn't have gone up there at night. Not unless—" She stopped, catching herself. "Unless?" Lucien asked gently. "Unless something or someone made him?" The words hung in the air like the toll of a distant bell. Her breathing quickened, and she rose suddenly as if needing to end the conversation. "I should check the bread in the kitchen," she said. "Please, excuse me." Lucien stood slowly, gave a small nod, and let himself out. As he walked back through the square, he noticed Etienne Morel standing near the fountain, talking with a man Lucien didn't recognize. Their voices were low, their faces close. When Morel caught sight of him, He turned his back quickly, pretending to examine the iron pump handle. Lucien felt the edges of the town tightening around its secret. Words were being exchanged in fragments behind hands and half-closed doors. He returned to the bakery as the afternoon light faded into a watery dusk. The smell of yeast and sugar filled the warm little shop. Behind the counter, the baker's daughter glanced up at him. Her lips parted as if to speak, then pressed shut again. "Evening," he said. She nodded, sliding a small loaf toward him. Her hands shook slightly. As he reached for the bread, he noticed the smudge of flour on her cheek and the way her eyes darted toward the door, as if she expected someone or feared them. He hesitated, then said softly, "Long day." She blinked and nodded, but her throat worked as if swallowing unspoken words. He did not press. That night, Lucien sat by his window with the lamp unlit. Below, the square lay in a soft gloom, lit only by the moon and the single candle in the watchmaker's window. He thought about Céline's white knuckles, about Morel turning his back, about the girl behind the counter who couldn't meet his eyes. They were all telling him something without speaking, their unease coiling in the quiet spaces between their gestures. Somewhere in the distance, the river lapped gently against the stones, indifferent to human grief. Lucien knew he was no closer to understanding the truth, but he was beginning to understand the people, and in towns like Saint-Aubin, that was where the truth always began. But the next morning, fog clung to the rooftops like a second skin. The bell of Saint-Aubin tolled once, a dull note that seemed to hang in the mist before fading into the valley. Lucien, already awake, sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold. He had not slept well. It wasn't the sound of the bell he had heard in his dreams, nor the sight of the watchmaker lying at the foot of the clock tower. It was the faces of the living, the tightened lips, the quick glances, the way they clutched at their own arms as if holding in their secrets. By the time he stepped outside, the streets were wet from a light drizzle. Water dripped from the eaves and pooled in the uneven stones. The scent of damp wood and chimney smoke drifted in the air. He crossed the square where the old fountain burbled quietly. On the edge of the basin, someone had left a small bouquet of wildflowers tied with a piece of rough twine. Lucien didn't have to guess who had left it. Céline had the habit of placing flowers at quiet corners, never where anyone would see her doing it. The watchmaker's death had started to leave its mark not only in whispers, but in gestures. A curtain that remained closed, in a house that usually welcomed sunlight. A man who now walked the longer path around the tower instead of cutting through the square. People spoke less, and when they did, it was often of trivial things, as though to talk about the weather could keep the ghost at bay. Lucien entered the bakery. The bell above the door gave a soft, uncertain ring. The girl behind the counter, Claire, looked up with the same faint wariness as before. "Morning," Lucien said, his voice quiet, as though the town itself demanded it. "Morning," she echoed. Her hands were dusted with flour. She wrapped his bread slowly, like each fold of paper was an effort to hold back some other thought. Lucien paid, but instead of leaving immediately, he lingered. He watched her eyes flick to the window, then to the back door. Finally, he said, "It's strange, isn't it? How quiet everything feels now." She hesitated, then nodded. "It's like he's still here somehow. I used to hear him winding the tower bell at night. I'd wake up and know it was him." "And now?" Lucien asked. She glanced down at the bread in his hand. "Now I still wake up, but I don't hear anything." The words slipped out before she could stop them. Her cheeks flushed, and she busied herself with a new loaf, as if the act of kneading could erase what she had said. Lucien left without pressing further. The fog had begun to lift when he walked toward the river, where the air always smelled faintly of silt and wet stone. He found Etienne Morel standing on the embankment, staring at the water. His hands were in his coat pockets, and his posture was rigid. "Morning," Lucien said. Morel turned, his jaw tightening. "Lucien, out early again." "Habit," Lucien replied. He followed the man's gaze to the water. "You come here often?" "Sometimes. Clears my head." Lucien nodded, letting the silence stretch. Morel's eyes were red at the edges, though whether from the wind or from sleepless nights, Lucien couldn't say. After a moment, Morel said, "I keep thinking about the last time I saw him. He was polishing a clock face in his shop. Didn't even look up when I came in, just said, 'It's late.' That was all." "It's late." Lucien tilted his head. "Did he mean the time of day?" Morel's mouth twitched. "I don't know. He had a way of saying things that felt like he meant more than he said." He kicked at a pebble near his boot and turned away from the river. "Anyway, nothing to do now but get on with things." But his voice carried no conviction, and Lucien noticed the way his shoulders hunched as he walked away, as though weighed down by something unseen. That evening, Lucien visited the churchyard. It wasn't yet the watchmaker's resting place. No burial had been arranged, but the space itself seemed to collect the town's unease. The graves glistened with rain, the moss darkened by moisture. A blackbird hopped between the stones, tilting its head as if listening. Near the entrance, Father Roland was locking the side door. He paused when he saw Lucien. "You're here late," the priest said. "I couldn't sleep," Lucien replied. "I thought maybe I'd walk." Father Roland looked at him for a long moment, then sighed. "It's strange. I didn't think he would leave such a shadow behind. He was a man of routine, of small words. But since he fell—" He gestured vaguely to the stones around them. "People come here and linger. They say nothing, but I can feel it. A kind of, waiting." Lucien followed his gaze to the graves. Waiting for what? "Perhaps for the story to settle into something they can bear," the priest said softly. "Or for the part of themselves that feels guilty to grow quiet again." Lucien did not ask what he meant. He simply listened to the rain drip from the church eaves. But that night, in his small home, Lucien lit no lamp. He sat by the window again, watching the candle flicker in the watchmaker's shop. He could almost imagine the old man there, winding his clocks, adjusting the tiny gears, oblivious to the fact that his life had become the center of a story that none of his neighbors could tell out loud. In the darkness, Lucien thought of the word Morel had repeated, "late," and of the silences that followed him through the streets. He felt the slow shift of the town's mood, like a current under calm water. The ghost that haunted Saint-Aubin was not the watchmaker's soul, but the memory of his presence, the routines that bound him to the place. Now that he was gone, the empty spaces he left behind were louder than any accusation, and somewhere in those empty spaces, Lucien knew, someone was hiding their fear. The wind shifted that night, carrying the scent of damp stone and chimney smoke through the narrow streets. Lucien had left his window open, as he often did, though the air was cool enough to raise the hairs on his arms. He couldn't sleep. It was not a matter of fear. It was the weight of something unspoken pressing at the edges of the town like the fog that crept along the riverbanks. When the first hint of light touched the rooftops, he went out. The square was nearly empty, save for a stray cat drinking from a puddle. The town had grown quieter with each passing day since the watchmaker's death, as if speaking above a whisper might provoke something they weren't ready to face. Lucien's path took him along the row of narrow houses behind the church, past shuttered windows and doors that seemed to frown in the grey light. He paused at one house in particular, paint flaking from the door, a small brass knocker in the shape of a hand. It was the home of André Vasseur, the bell-ringer's cousin. Lucien had passed the house several times in recent days and noticed the same thing. The shutters were always closed now. The door, once left ajar in the afternoons to let in light, had remained firmly shut since the night of the death. He raised his hand as if to knock, then let it fall. Instead, he simply listened. A faint sound drifted through the wood, maybe the scrape of a chair, maybe nothing at all. He moved on, but the image of the closed door lingered. At the market that morning, the air was damp and smelled of earth and onions. A few women sorted through carrots, speaking in hushed tones. Lucien saw Céline there, the seamstress with the quiet eyes. She was buying bread and a single apple. When she noticed him, she hesitated, almost as if considering walking away, but then offered a thin smile. "Morning," Lucien said. "Morning," she answered, her voice soft. "Not many out today?" "No," she said, tucking the apple into her basket. "It feels like everyone's inside." Her eyes flicked toward the houses beyond the square. Lucien followed her gaze. "I passed by Vasseur's place earlier. Shutters closed. Haven't seen him in days." Céline lowered her voice. "He doesn't want to talk to anyone." "My cousin said she saw him at his window late at night, just standing there, staring." "At what?" She shook her head. "Nothing, or maybe everything." A silence settled between them. The distant clang of a milk pail startled a pigeon from the eaves. Céline finally said, "Do you think someone knows something?" Lucien studied her face. He saw the tension in the corner of her mouth, the way she gripped her basket a little too tightly. "In towns like ours," he said, "someone always knows something. They just don't say it." Later that day, Lucien walked toward the clock tower. The stones were still damp from last night's rain, and the iron railing was slick beneath his hand. He paused at the base, looking up at the dark windows. A thin wind hissed through the tower's cracks like a whisper that refused to form words. A sound behind him made him turn. It was Etienne Morel again, his coat collar turned up against the wind. He glanced at the tower and then quickly away. "You spend a lot of time here?" Morel said. "Not so much," Lucien replied calmly. "I walk. I notice things." Morel nodded, but his eyes betrayed unease. "I saw Vasseur this morning. He was leaving the church. He looked wrong, pale, like he'd swallowed a ghost." Lucien waited, letting the man fill the silence. "He saw me," Morel continued, "but didn't nod. He just kept walking, like he didn't want anyone to see him out." Lucien considered this, then asked, "Did you ever visit the watchmaker after hours?" Morel hesitated. "Once or twice. He'd fix my father's old clock." "Why?" "No reason," Lucien said. He wasn't looking for answers. He was watching the man's reaction, the slight tremor in his hands, the way his eyes kept darting to the tower and back to the safety of the ground. That evening, as darkness gathered, Lucien passed Vasseur's house once more. A single candle flickered behind the shutters, the light wavering like it was afraid to be seen. He knocked, softly. There was a pause, then footsteps, The door opened only a crack. A narrow slice of Vasseur's face appeared, his eyes bloodshot, his hair uncombed. "Lucien," he said, his voice hoarse. "Evening," Lucien said. "I thought I'd see how you were doing." "I'm fine," Vasseur muttered. His hand gripped the edge of the door, knuckles white. "You haven't been out much." "Busy?" Lucien glanced past him into the dim room. The air smelled faintly of oil and damp wood. On the table behind Vasseur sat a half-finished meal and a glass of wine that had barely been touched. "I won't stay," Lucien said. "I only wondered if you'd heard anything. The night it happened." Vasseur's jaw tightened. I was asleep." Even as he spoke, his eyes shifted to the side, towards something unseen deeper in the house. A shadow, a memory. Lucien couldn't tell which. "I understand," Lucien said simply, stepping back. The door closed almost immediately. A bolt slid into place on the other side. As Lucien walked home, he thought about the sound of that bolt, the hurried finality of it. The closed door was more than wood and iron. It was a wall of fear, the kind that built itself quietly in the hearts of men who carried secrets. Saint-Aubin was shrinking into itself. Behind each shutter and door, people were hiding from the echo of the clock tower, from the quiet insistence of memory. Lucien paused at the corner, glancing back. In that narrow street, lit by a thin sliver of moon, every door seemed like Vasseur's, tight-lipped, withholding, and he knew that sooner or later, one of them would have to open. The rain had stopped sometime during the night, leaving the streets damp and shining under the pale morning light. Lucien walked through the square, his shoes clicking softly against the wet stones. He noticed how the puddles reflected the muted colours of the houses, each window and shutter slightly warped in the water's surface. The town felt heavier now. It wasn't the weather, it was the way people had begun to avoid each other's eyes. Conversations that once took place in the open square now happened in corners, behind hands, or not at all. Lucien had seen this before in other small towns. Tragedy always became a mirror. People started seeing shadows in each other's gestures, blame in the tilt of a head, guilt in the way someone crossed the street too quickly. At the bakery, he overheard the first whisper of the day. "I heard he was at the tower that night." A woman's voice, low and uncertain, came from the corner where two neighbours leaned close over the bread counter. They glanced toward Lucien, then quickly away. He didn't need to ask who he was. By now, the town had chosen its silent candidate, André Vasseur. The signs had been there for days, closed shutters, bolted doors, the candlelight flickering behind the cracks. His absence from the usual routines had spoken louder than any accusation. In Saint-Aubin, withdrawing from sight was almost an admission of guilt. Lucien bought his loaf and left, letting the murmurs linger behind him. He saw Vasseur later that morning, walking stiffly along the lane behind the church. His coat was buttoned wrong, and his hat sat askew on his head. He carried himself like someone expecting a blow. Lucien didn't call out. He simply followed at a distance, letting the rhythm of the man's walk tell its own story. There was hesitation in every step, a pause before each corner, as if he feared someone would be waiting there. When Vasseur reached his own door, he hesitated for a long moment, scanning the street. His eyes caught Lucien's for an instant, and his face twitched, half a greeting, half a flinch. Then he disappeared inside, closing the door with that same hurried finality. By midday, the market had swelled with quiet energy. Farmers and shopkeepers moved between stalls, exchanging words that carried the weight of unspoken judgment. Céline, the seamstress, stood beside a basket of leeks, speaking with Henri, the butcher. Lucien caught fragments of their conversation as he approached. "He won't even come to Mass anymore," Henri muttered. "Father Benoit went to see him," Céline said, "but he wouldn't open the door." Henri leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You remember the argument? The one they had over the chimes?" Céline's eyes flicked toward Lucien, then back to the butcher. "Quiet," she whispered. "He's listening." Lucien paused, letting them feel his presence without confronting them. After a long moment, he said simply, "People talk too easily when they're afraid." Henri grunted, half in agreement, half in embarrassment. So that evening, Lucien visited the tavern. The low-ceilinged room smelled of smoke and wine, its windows fogged by the damp air outside. A few men sat at the wooden tables, speaking in subdued voices. When Lucien entered, the conversation faltered. He ordered a glass of red wine and sat by the wall, watching. Old Marcel, the woodcutter, eventually leaned toward him. His face was lined and weathered, his eyes small and sharp. "You've seen him, haven't you?" Marcel said. "Who?" "You know who, Vasseur? He looks like a man carrying something he can't set down. My father used to say when a man walks like that, he's either in love or in trouble. And Vasseur's too old for love." Lucien swirled the wine in his glass, letting the silence stretch. "You think he killed the watchmaker?" Marcel shrugged. "I don't think anything, but the town's thinking it for me." A faint laugh rippled through the tavern, dry and uncomfortable. Lucien noticed how no one outright denied it. Gossip in Saint-Aubin rarely needed proof, it just needed repetition. 2 nights later, Lucien found himself walking past Vasseur's house again. The shutters were closed, as always, but this time a thin thread of smoke drifted from the chimney. He hesitated, then approached the door. He didn't knock immediately, he just listened. A chair scraped, a cough, then silence. Finally, he knocked once. The door opened after a long pause, only wide enough for Vasseur's face to appear in the sliver of light. His eyes were ringed with shadows. "Lucien," he said, his voice rough. "Evening," Lucien said. "I thought I'd see how you were doing. I told you I'm fine. You're becoming the center of the town's conversations." Vasseur flinched. "I don't care about them." Lucien leaned slightly closer, speaking softly. "They care about you. Or rather, about what they think you might have done." Vasseur's mouth opened, then closed. His gaze slid away toward the dim interior of the house. A clock ticked somewhere inside, slow and relentless. "I was at home," Vasseur said finally. "I didn't leave that night." "I didn't say you did," Lucien replied. For a moment, neither spoke. The street was so quiet that Lucien could hear the faint drip of water from a nearby gutter. Then, without another word, Vasseur closed the door again. The next morning, Lucien returned to the square. People were gathered in small knots, speaking in lowered voices. A new rumor had spread overnight. Someone had seen Vasseur near the tower after dark. No one claimed to know who had first said it. That didn't matter. The town had its suspect now, and the story would grow legs of its own. Lucien leaned against the fountain, listening to the fragments as they passed between lips like contraband. He went there to argue with the watchmaker again. He's been hiding ever since. You can see it in his eyes. He watched the faces as they spoke, the small flare of satisfaction that comes with sharing something forbidden, the quick glance over a shoulder to see who might be listening. By the time the church bell rang noon, the story had hardened into something close to fact. In that evening, Lucien walked home under a sky streaked with fading light. He passed the clock tower, the street empty, but for his own echoing steps. He paused and looked up at the silent face of the tower, its hands catching the last glint of the sun. The town had chosen its suspect. It always did. But as Lucien watched the quiet windows, he felt no certainty, only the familiar weight of something unspoken pressing in on the walls of Saint-Aubin. The truth, he thought, rarely arrived with the noise of accusation. More often it seeped through closed doors in the small betrayals of silence. The morning mist clung to the low streets of Saint-Aubin, softening the edges of the stone houses and muting the colours of their shutters. Lucien woke early before the town had fully stirred and sat at his small kitchen table with a cup of coffee. He didn't write notes or draw diagrams. He simply thought, listening to the distant, uneven toll of the clock tower bell. He had learned long ago that answers in small towns rarely came from movement or noise. They arrived in fragments, in the quiet patterns of behavior that people didn't realize they were leaving behind. When he stepped out into the street, the town felt suspended, like a painting left unfinished. He took the long way to the square, passing the narrow lane that ran behind the butcher's shop. Henri was there, sweeping the step. He glanced up when Lucien passed, but didn't speak. His eyes flicked toward the Vasseur house down the lane, and then quickly back to his broom. That small, involuntary gesture told Lucien more than words could. The butcher, like the rest of the town, was waiting, not for proof, but for confirmation of the suspicion they already wanted to believe. Lucien continued to the café and sat at his usual table near the window. He didn't order anything at first. He just listened. Two women were speaking quietly at the next table. He kept his gaze on the street outside, letting their words drift over like smoke. "You saw him again last night? Light in the window? Alone? Always alone? That's not normal." The café owner, Jeanne, shuffled past with a tray. Her face carried a pinched look that she wore whenever the town was simmering with unspoken tension. "Coffee?" she asked. Lucien nodded. "How's business?" she shrugged. "Quiet? People don't linger when things feel unsettled?" Her voice dropped, and her eyes flicked toward the two women. "They all think they know, but no one really does." Lucien let a pause stretch, then said softly, "And you? What do you think?" Jeanne hesitated, pressing her lips together before speaking. "I think some people carry guilt even when they've done nothing wrong. And some carry nothing at all, even when they should." It was a careful answer, one that revealed nothing but hinted at everything. After leaving the café, Lucien walked to the edge of town where the path curved toward the marsh. It was a route he often took when he wanted to think. The air smelled of wet earth and distant wood smoke. The reeds swayed gently in the breeze, whispering like old voices. He crouched by the edge of the path and traced a line in the damp soil with his finger, letting his thoughts settle. In his mind, he retraced the last week as if moving through the rooms of a house, the watchmaker dead, the town leaning toward Vasseur, the whispers turning into quiet certainties. Yet something in the rhythm of it all felt wrong. It was too neat, too easy. Vasseur's fear was real, yes, but fear didn't always mean guilt. Sometimes it meant a man was being slowly crushed under the weight of other people's assumptions. So that afternoon, Lucien returned to the square and sat on the fountain's edge, pretending to read a newspaper. He saw André Vasseur's door open across the way. The man emerged hesitantly, carrying a small sack of potatoes. He walked with his head low, shoulders hunched, as though the air itself had grown heavier. From behind her lace curtains, Céline watched. Lucienne caught the movement of the curtain and the glint of her eyes. Within moments, another curtain stirred across the street. The town was an organism now, breathing through its windows, feeding on its own suspicion. Vasseur reached the greengrocer, spoke briefly, and turned back toward home. Lucienne noted the stiffness in his hands, the awkward way he avoided every passing gaze. Later, Lucienne stopped by the church. Father Benoit was alone inside, polishing the brass candle holders. The air was cool and smelled faintly of wax and stone. "You've seen him?" the priest asked, as if continuing a conversation they hadn't yet begun. "Yes," Lucienne said. "He doesn't look well." The priest nodded slowly. "He hasn't confessed, if that's what you're wondering. But he carries something. I can see it when he bows his head." "Guilt?" Lucienne asked. "Not necessarily. Sometimes shame and guilt look the same, even to the one feeling them." Lucienne let that thought settle. It fit with the picture he was building, one that wasn't about fingerprints or alibis, but about the invisible weight pressing on the town. As evening fell, the sky over Saint-Aubin turned a soft violet. Lamps flickered to life in windows, one by one, like cautious eyes. Lucienne took a slow walk past the clock tower. He paused at the base, looking up. The stone was dark and damp from the recent rain, and a faint smell of moss lingered. He imagined the watchmaker in his last moments, alone in this tower, surrounded by the silence of his own life. Whoever had been there with him, if anyone had, carried not just the memory of that moment, but the echo of a choice they could never undo. When he returned to his small apartment, he lit a lamp and sat at the desk by the window. He didn't write much, just a few simple lines in his notebook. The town wants a story. Vasseur fits the part. Fear does not equal guilt. He closed the notebook and leaned back, listening to the faint hum of night insects beyond the glass. Somewhere in the distance, a door closed. A dog barked once, then fell silent. Lucienne had the sense that the town was holding its breath, waiting for something inevitable, though no one could say what it was. In the next morning, a small change came. As Lucienne walked to the bakery, he saw Vasseur again, but this time he was not alone. A boy of about 12 stood beside him, carrying a basket. The boy glanced up nervously as though aware that every eye in town might be on them. Lucienne watched as the man and boy walked together to the square. Their steps were uneven, their conversation muted, but there was a flicker of humanity in it, a reminder that Vasseur was not just a suspect. He was part of this town's fragile, tangled web of lives. And in that quiet observation, Lucienne felt a shift, small, almost imperceptible, but real. The truth, if it existed, was moving closer, not with a shout, but with the soft inevitability of a shadow at dusk. So the next day dawned with a muted light, the kind that flattened the streets of Saint-Aubin and blurred the edges of the rooftops against the sky. Lucienne stepped outside his small apartment, pausing to feel the air. It carried the faint scent of the river and of damp earth. Nothing in the town looked different, yet something in the rhythm of it had shifted. He crossed the square, nodding silently to Jeanne as she swept the steps of the café. She gave him a brief, searching look, as though waiting for him to confirm or deny something she could not say aloud. Inside, he chose a table near the window again. He didn't order right away, he rarely needed to. Jeanne placed a coffee in front of him without asking, her movements clipped and efficient. "There's a letter," she said quietly, as though mentioning the weather. A letter? Yes, for the gendarme. Found it slipped under their door this morning. She leaned closer. Anonymous, they say. Lucien stirred his coffee slowly, letting the words settle. Do they know who sent it? Jeanne shook her head. Only that it's about Vasseur, about the night of the murder. Lucien didn't rush to the gendarmerie. He knew that in towns like Saint-Aubin, anything left at a door might become a storm by midday. Instead, he took his usual path toward the river, letting the conversation he'd overheard in the café drift into his thoughts. The river was still that morning, a long strip of dull silver. Ducks moved slowly along its surface, leaving ripples that spread wider than they should. He stood on the bank, hands in his coat pockets, and thought about letters. Anonymous letters weren't confessions, they were weapons. People didn't write them to tell the truth. They wrote them to protect themselves, to wound others, to tilt the balance of suspicion. A letter meant the town had reached a new stage in its quiet panic. Someone had chosen to act, though not in the open. By noon, the letter had done what such letters always did. It reached every ear in the square. Lucien returned to the café to find two men speaking in low, excited voices. Or said he was at the tower that night. Saw him go in, they said. Lucien didn't ask for details. Details would come to him on their own. He ordered a slice of bread and cheese, listening as the murmurs swelled around him like water filling a basin. When he left, he walked toward the Vasseur house. He did not intend to knock, only to see. Vasseur was standing by his small garden, raking leaves that barely covered the soil. His movements were slow, methodical, as though each leaf carried weight. Lucien paused at the gate. "Good afternoon," he said. Vasseur looked up, startled. His eyes had dark circles under them, and his lips seemed dry, as if words had been stuck there too long. "Afternoon? You've been keeping busy?" Vasseur gave a small shrug. "The leaves don't stop falling just because people talk." He looked away quickly, the rake trembling slightly in his hand. Lucien didn't push further. He let the silence stretch, broken only by the scrape of the rake on the soil. So that evening, Lucien visited the gendarmerie. The letter was there, folded on the desk, already creased from passing through several hands. He asked quietly if he could see it. It was written in small, uneven handwriting. "The man you are looking for walks freely. He was at the tower that night. He carries the weight of the clockmaker's death, and the town sees it in his eyes. Ask him why he went there after the bell stopped. No signature. No proof." Lucien handed it back without comment. The officer, a young man with a restless energy, leaned forward. "What do you think?" he asked. "I think letters like that tell you more about the writer than the accused," Lucien said. "Meaning? Meaning someone is afraid. Afraid enough to speak without speaking. Either they fear Vasseur, or they fear being seen themselves." At night, Lucien couldn't sleep. He sat by the window, watching the street under the weak glow of the single lamp-post. A stray cat crossed the road, paused to sniff at a doorway, then disappeared into the shadows. He thought of the letter, of the hand that wrote it. Someone in this quiet town had chosen to deepen another man's isolation. Perhaps they had done it out of guilt, perhaps out of envy. He thought of the watchmaker, alone in his tower. He imagined the sound of the final bell that night, echoing across the rooftops before silence settled. Someone had been there, maybe Vasseur, maybe another, but the town had already decided who would carry the blame. The next morning brought a second, quieter revelation. Lucien was walking by the river again when he noticed a figure crouched near the reeds. It was the same boy who had been seen with Vasseur the previous day, poking at the water with a stick. The boy glanced up nervously as Lucien approached. "Out early," Lucien said gently. The boy nodded but said nothing. His shoes were damp. "You help Monsieur Vasseur sometimes?" Lucien asked. The boy hesitated. "Mamma says I should. He gives me apples, and he tells me stories." "What kind of stories?" The boy's voice lowered. "About his brother, the one who left. He said the clock tower used to be theirs, that they would climb it when they were boys." Lucien felt a small click in his mind, a piece of the puzzle sliding into place. This wasn't about a single night. It was about old memories, about attachments no one in the town had thought to mention. Later, in the café, Lucien thought about the letter and the boy's words. He imagined the unseen threads, a man trapped by his past, a town trapped by its whispers, and someone, unseen, stirring the water with an anonymous note. The second secret wasn't the letter itself. It was the past surfacing, the hidden life of the man everyone watched, the quiet grief of a family fractured long before the murder. As evening approached, Lucien felt the town tightening around that invisible core of tension. The truth was moving closer, but not cleanly, not in a straight line. It would arrive like everything in Saint-Aubin did, slowly, quietly, through the cracks people didn't know they left behind. The morning mist clung to Saint-Aubin like a damp sheet, blurring the cobblestones and softening the shapes of the shuttered houses. Lucien walked through it quietly, his shoes making a dull, wet sound. He had slept little. The anonymous letter, the boy's hesitant story, and the memory of Vasseur's trembling hands kept circling his thoughts like restless birds. In the square, the café was only half awake. Jean wiped down tables with slow, absent-minded motions. Her usual sharpness had softened into something watchful, as if she were waiting for someone to speak first. Lucien entered without a word. She set his cup down but didn't leave. "You've heard?" she said finally. "Heard what?" "Vasseur hasn't left his house since yesterday evening. Someone says they saw the curtains drawn tight, not even a light." Lucien nodded. That, in itself, was not unusual. People under pressure often hid behind shutters. But in a town like Saint-Aubin, the act of closing oneself off only confirmed the suspicions pressing in from outside. After finishing his coffee, Lucien walked toward Vasseur's street. The air felt heavier here, as though the houses themselves carried the weight of unspoken words. At the gate, he paused. The garden was still. The rake leaned against the wall, forgotten. The curtains were drawn, just as Jeanne said. He knocked lightly, then waited. A shuffling sound approached, and the door opened a few inches. Vasseur's face appeared in the gap, unshaven, hollow-eyed, his skin pale, as if he'd spent the night under water. "May I come in?" Lucien asked. Vasseur hesitated, then opened the door without speaking. The room smelled of stale air and something faintly metallic, like old keys. A single lamp flickered in the corner, though it was late morning. "You're not well," Lucien said gently. Vasseur sank into a chair, his movements slow and brittle. "I hear them outside," he murmured. "They stop talking when I pass, but I hear it anyway. In the walls, in the air." Lucien remained standing, letting the silence draw out. He had learned long ago that the quiet was where people revealed themselves. After a moment, Vasseur leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You know they'll decide it's me." Even if I never set foot in that tower that night, they've already decided. You were there, though, Lucienne said softly, careful to keep it free of accusation. Vasseur's head jerked up, a flicker of panic in his eyes. Who told you that? A boy mentioned the stories you tell, about climbing the tower when you were young, about your brother. The man's gaze softened, his shoulders slumping. Yes, I went. I go sometimes when I can't sleep. That night, I wanted to hear the clock. It's foolish, I know. The bell, it reminds me of before, when we were still together. Lucien said nothing. He watched Vasseur's fingers twitch on the armrest, the way his mouth tightened before each sentence, as if pushing words through a narrow passage. I didn't kill him, he whispered. I found him, sitting at his table. His head was down, like he was sleeping. I thought maybe he was, but when I touched him... He paused, shuddering. Cold, heavy. I left. I couldn't stay. Lucienne felt the weight of the man's words settle in the small room. Guilt wasn't always about action. It often clung to those who had merely witnessed, who had walked away instead of calling out. In Saint-Aubin, that was enough to stain a man for life. Why not tell them? Lucien asked quietly. Vasseur's eyes darted to the shuttered window. And have them believe I did it? They already think it. They've been waiting for me to fail at something since I came back. Since she left me? The last words hung in the air like smoke. Lucienne didn't need to ask who she was. In small towns, absences spoke louder than names. You've been carrying more than this for a long time, Lucienne said. Vasseur laughed once, a short, bitter sound. I've been carrying a life no one wants to see, that's all. When Lucien left, he walked slowly through the square, feeling the invisible weight pressing on Vasseur's house. People glanced toward it without meaning to. Two men near the fountain spoke in low voices, and when Lucien passed, they fell silent. The moral pressure was working. Not from the police, official authority had little reach here, but from the quiet, relentless rhythm of the town itself. Whispers seeped into walls, into windows, into dreams. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the roofs, Lucien returned to the café. The regulars were there, some pretending to read the paper, others staring into cups. He won't last the week, someone muttered. Lucien didn't ask who they meant. Everyone knew. Late that night, Lucien walked the empty street outside Vasseur's house. A single light glowed now, upstairs. He imagined the man pacing, or sitting in a chair with his head in his hands, feeling the walls close in. Saint-Aubin had its own kind of justice. It didn't require proof or confession. It simply pressed and pressed until the soul beneath it gave way. Lucien stood for a while, listening to the silence. The wind carried the faint clatter of a loose shutter from the tower. In that moment, he knew something had shifted again. The town was no longer waiting for the police. It was waiting for Vasseur to break. By the next morning, the boy by the river was gone. No children lingered near Vasseur's gate anymore. Even Jeanne, usually blunt, avoided saying his name. Lucien felt the town holding its breath, and in that fragile pause he understood. The mystery was no longer about who had killed the old clockmaker. It was about how much guilt a man could carry in public before it crushed him. He had seen it before in other towns under other roofs. It rarely ended cleanly. The wind shifted that night, carrying the faint scent of the river into the streets of Saint-Aubin. It was the kind of night when the town felt emptier than usual, as if it were holding its breath. Lucien sat by his window, the lamp casting a small circle of light on the table. He had not lit a fire. He liked the way the darkness pressed against the glass, reflecting his own face back at him. He had spent the day drifting through the square, nodding to people, asking no questions. He didn't need to. The town was speaking in silences now, in half-finished sentences. Vasseur had not been seen in 2 days. Even the curtains in his house no longer moved. Lucien rose, put on his coat, and stepped into the cool night. His steps echoed against the stones. He walked without urgency, the way a man walks when he wants to seem casual, though his thoughts were anything but. When he reached Vasseur's gate, the garden was as still as the rest of the street. Moonlight traced the iron bars. He noticed a faint glow upstairs, a lamp left on, or perhaps a candle. He waited a moment, listening. Nothing stirred. He thought of knocking, but didn't. Some doors only opened when the wait inside became unbearable. Instead, he turned and walked slowly toward the square. But the next morning, the silence broke. It was Jeanne who brought the news, her voice lowered to a whisper when Lucien entered the café. "They found him," she said, eyes glistening. "This morning, the postman saw the front door open. He called for him, but no answer. He went in." Lucien waited. He didn't ask. In his chair, she continued, by the window he was gone, just gone. There was no surprise in her tone, only the heavy inevitability of someone describing the last page of a story everyone had already read. Lucien walked to the house with slow steps. A small crowd had gathered, though at a respectful distance. They stood in clusters, speaking in murmurs, hands tucked into pockets or clasped behind backs. The front door stood open. Inside, the air was heavy and still. He found Vasseur in the front room, just as Jeanne had said. The man sat slumped in his chair, head tilted slightly as if he were listening to something far away. The faint lamp glow caught the curve of his jaw, the hollows under his eyes. No violence, no note, just absence. Lucien stood in the doorway, taking in the small details. The cup of cold tea on the table, the window cracked slightly open, the soft imprint of fingers on the armrest where Vasseur had gripped it one last time. He heard the voices of the neighbours behind him, low and careful. Their words carried that mix of sympathy and relief that small towns knew too well. The police arrived, of course. They came with polite efficiency, speaking in quiet tones as if the dead could still hear. A doctor pronounced the death natural, heart failure, likely worsened by stress. The official report would be short, clean, but the unspoken report written across every face in Saint-Aubin was longer. The town did this, the whispers, the waiting, the silence that became too loud to bear. Lucien left before they carried the body out. He didn't need to see that part. He had seen it before. The square that afternoon felt different. The tension that had coiled for weeks was gone, replaced by a strange lightness. People walked a little faster, spoke a little louder. The burden had shifted off their shoulders, though no one would admit to having carried it. Lucien sat at his usual table outside the café, hands wrapped around a cup that had gone cold. He watched life resume its rhythm, a woman sweeping her doorstep, children chasing each other across the square, a man adjusting the flowers in his window box. No one mentioned the clock tower. No one mentioned the old man whose life had ended under its shadow. That evening, Lucien returned to the river. He stood on the bank, watching the water slide past, carrying away leaves and reflections. He thought about Vasseur, about his long, thin fingers, the tremor in his voice, the way he had glanced toward the window, as if the town were always looking in. Guilt, Lucien knew, was a quiet poison. It didn't matter if you had committed the act or only carried the memory of walking away. Some souls couldn't hold that weight for long. He thought too about the letter, about the boy's whispered confession of watching from the shadows. He wondered if the boy understood yet that he had witnessed not just a death, but the slow unmaking of a manatistiteri. As night fell, Lucien returned home. He lit a small lamp and sat in his chair. The room felt both too quiet and too familiar. He considered writing a letter, perhaps to someone outside Saint-Aubin, someone who would never know the smell of the river or the creak of the café door. But what could he say? That a man had died because he couldn't carry what others had handed him. That the truth was a weight that didn't always need words to crush a life. Instead, he sat and listened to the soft sounds of the house, letting the evening close around him. By the time he finally rose to draw the curtains, he noticed the moonlight catching the tower in the distance. The old clock face looked pale and empty, like an eye that had stopped watching. In the stillness, Lucien understood something without speaking it aloud. The case was not over, not really. The town had accepted its quiet collapse, but the truth, whatever remained of it, was still waiting in the shadows. The day after Vasseur's death, Saint-Aubin seemed to exhale. The air felt lighter, though no one said why. Lucien noticed it first in the café. Jeanne had rearranged the chairs, humming softly to herself, as if some quiet tension had finally left the room. A few regulars were gathered around the counter, voices low, but no longer tight. "They say it was his heart," someone murmured. "Of course," another replied, stirring his coffee. "He was an old man. All that worry. It was bound to happen." Lucien sipped his own coffee in silence, feeling the words settle into the air like dust. A tidy explanation, clean and unthreatening. No one mentioned the clock tower, no one mentioned the months of whispers, the late-night glances, or the silent blame that had passed through the streets like smoke. In the official record, Vasseur had died of heart failure. The gendarme had written it plainly. No one argued. Why would they? A neat cause was easier to carry than the murky truth. By afternoon, the town had returned to its routines. A baker's boy ran down the street, his basket swinging. A woman hung out her washing, humming a song. Life had resumed its rhythm, each gesture smoothing over the memory of the man who had sat by his window, watching the town that quietly judged him. Lucien walked slowly through the square. He could feel the lie settling into the stones beneath his feet, as much a part of the town as the river or the church bell. It wasn't a malicious lie, not exactly. It was the kind that people built together, word by word, for their own comfort. Well, that evening, he was invited, informally, to join a small group at the café. It wasn't quite a celebration, but the mood was looser than it had been in weeks. Old Lefebvre, who ran the post office, leaned back in his chair and said, "It's strange, isn't it? One day he's there, the next, gone. But perhaps it's better this way. Peaceful, you know." No one contradicted him. "He'd been alone too long," added Jeanne. "That's what does it to a man sometimes." Lucien watched their faces as they spoke, noting the tiny flickers of relief, the unspoken agreement that no one needed to look any further. The funeral was small. A few distant relatives came from the next town, their expressions dutiful rather than grieving. The priest spoke of patience, of quiet lives and quiet ends. The wind stirred the grass and the church bell tolled, each note drifting toward the river. Afterward, the mourners dispersed quickly. By evening, the square felt as if nothing had happened at all. The only sign of the funeral was the faint smell of damp earth carried on the breeze. In the following days, the clock tower stood empty again, its silence deeper than before. Lucien climbed the hill one afternoon, his steps slow, deliberate. He reached the tower just before sunset, the sky washed in pale orange. The door was unlocked. Inside, dust motes floated in the thin light, and the air smelled of old wood and stone. He paused near the staircase, tracing a hand along the railing. There was no sound but the faint creak of the tower settling. He thought of Vasseur here, climbing these stairs in the quiet evenings, perhaps stopping halfway to catch his breath. He imagined him standing at the window, looking down at the town that had slowly turned away from him. Lucien felt the weight of the unspoken truth pressing against the walls. There would be no investigation, no further questions. The town had accepted its version of events, and that was that. Tonight, as he walked back through the square, he saw the small shifts of life resuming. A couple of men were setting up a game of cards in the cafe. Children were chasing each other along the edge of the fountain. Laughter returned in cautious bursts, like a bird testing the wind before flight. But behind it all, Lucien sensed the faint hum of denial, the way the mind hums after telling itself a story enough times to believe it. A few evenings later, the boy, the same one who had once whispered to Lucien about watching the tower, approached him in the street. His face was pale, eyes darting toward the houses as if afraid someone might hear. "They say he died of his heart," the boy said softly. Lucien nodded. "But he was fine when I saw him. He waved to me." The boy's voice faltered. Lucien placed a hand on his shoulder, steady but not warm. "Sometimes," he said, "people stop carrying what they've been carrying. And sometimes that is all it takes." The boy stared at him for a moment, then nodded slowly. A new silence grew between them, heavier than before. Over the next week, a kind of fragile cheer returned to Saint-Aubin. The bakery smelled of warm bread in the mornings. The bell tower rang on the hour, its echo scattering across the rooftops. And yet every so often Lucien caught someone glancing toward the tower with that same fleeting unease. They all felt it, even if they would never say it. That the truth had been buried alongside Vasseur, and the lie they lived with now was both lighter and heavier than the reality they had avoided. Lucien kept his observations to himself. In Saint-Aubin, peace was often built on things left unsaid. Lucien woke early the next morning. The air was cool, carrying the scent of the river and damp soil from last night's rain. He lingered by his window, watching the town stretch into its quiet routine. Smoke rose from a chimney. A dog barked once and fell silent. The town had moved on. He could see it in the slow, methodical gestures of its people, the woman sweeping her step, the baker turning his sign to open, the old man guiding a bicycle across the square. Each movement seemed to say, "It is finished. We will not look back." Lucien closed his window and dressed without hurry. His hands moved with the same careful deliberation he brought to every morning ritual, buttoning his shirt, pouring the coffee, folding the newspaper though he barely read it. He had long ago learned that the truth often lived in these small, unremarkable moments. He walked to the square as he always did, his steps slow, his gaze seemingly unfocused. People greeted him politely, but there was a new ease in their voices. "Morning, Monsieur Lucien," Jeanne called from the café door. Her apron was dusted with flour. Fresh rolls today?" He nodded, offering a faint smile. Inside, the smell of warm bread and coffee wrapped around him. He chose his usual table by the window. A few regulars were already seated, their voices low and light. "They've sealed up the clock tower," someone said. "Better that way. Less to remind people." Lucien listened without looking up. A decision had been made collectively, wordlessly. The town would not speak of the tower any more. Later that morning, Lucien visited the gendarmerie. The officer on duty, a young man with a clean uniform and restless energy, looked up in mild surprise. "Ah, Monsieur Lucien, everything's settled now, I think," he said, sliding a folder across the desk. "The death certificate has been filed. Heart failure, nothing unusual." Lucien opened the folder without asking permission. The report was brief, the handwriting neat. It might have been about anyone in any town. Male, 74. No family in residence. Found deceased in home. Cause, natural, probable cardiac arrest. No mention of whispered accusations, of guilt carried silently between neighbors, of the subtle currents that had pulled the old man down like water over stone. Lucien closed the folder and handed it back. "Yes," he said. "Nothing unusual." The young officer hesitated. "Do you think there's more to it?" Lucien held the young man's gaze for a long moment. He thought of the boy in the street, of the way the town had quietly conspired to let the lie settle into place. He thought of Vasseur's final days, and the long pause in the man's eyes when he had last seen him alive. "No," Lucien said finally. "It is as you wrote it." The officer nodded, relieved. That afternoon, Lucien walked along the river. The water was calm, carrying bits of leaves and broken twigs downstream. He stopped at a bench shaded by a chestnut tree and sat there, letting the town's quiet hum wrap around him. He thought about speaking, about gathering the few threads of truth he carried and laying them out for all to see. He could tell them about the glances, the silences, the weight of gossip that had settled like stones in a man's chest. He could say that they had all, in some quiet way, shared in the act that led to Vasseur's end. But to what purpose? Would it bring comfort? Number, it would only stir guilt and resentment. The town would turn inward, defending its lie more fiercely, and Lucien would become a shadow in their eyes, an unwelcome mirror. He watched a small boat drift past, its oars dipping lazily into the water. The choice was simple, and it was not even a choice. He had made it long before he named it. He would remain silent. Days passed. His silence became another stone in the foundation of the town's fragile peace. He continued his routines, the same slow walks, the same quiet coffees. He greeted the baker, nodded to the schoolchildren, listened to the murmured conversations that now avoided the tower completely. Every now and then he caught someone glancing at him with a fleeting unease, as if they sensed he knew more than he should. But no one asked, and Lucien offered no hint. One evening, as the sun dipped low and turned the windows of the town to gold, Jeanne approached him outside the café. Her hands were red from washing dishes. "You've been quiet lately," she said. "I suppose I have," Lucien replied. She hesitated, looking down at her apron. "It's strange, isn't it? How someone can be here one day and gone the next. It makes you wonder what really matters in the end." Lucien studied her face, the small tremor at the corner of her mouth, the way her eyes flicked toward the tower in the distance. "Yes," he said softly, "it does make you wonder." At the dinner night, Lucien sat by his window, watching the town fade into darkness. A few lamps burned in the square, casting long, thin shadows. From his vantage he could see the outline of the tower against the night sky, still silent and empty. He thought of Vasseur standing there in his final evenings, looking down at a world that had quietly closed its doors to him. Lucien had never heard the man raise his voice, never seen him protest the invisible verdict the town had passed. And now, in death, the man had given the town a gift, a story simple enough to believe, light enough to carry. Lucien leaned back, letting the night settle around him. His own part in this was as small and as heavy as anyone else's. He would carry the truth alone, not as a burden, but as a quiet companion, something to hold in the stillness between days. The next morning, life in Saint-Aubin went on as if the old man and the clock tower had always been part of some distant, half-forgotten memory. Children played by the fountain. The market filled with voices and the smell of cheese and fresh bread. A dog barked at a passing cart. Lucien moved through it all like a shadow stitched to the fabric of the town, present, observing, invisible in his own way. He felt no triumph, no regret, only the slow, steady rhythm of life continuing under a truth that would never be spoken. The summer drifted into autumn almost without notice. Days shortened, and the wind carried the smell of wood smoke from the hills. Saint-Aubin seemed to have settled back into the rhythm it preferred, quiet, unremarkable, untroubled by the shadows of the old clock tower. Lucien noticed it in the market first. People smiled again, not with joy, but with that mild, polite warmth that suited small-town life. Conversations had turned back to weather, to harvests, to the price of apples and cheese. If the tower or its lonely inhabitant came up at all, it was in passing, and always with a kind of detached courtesy. Shame about the old man, someone would say, as if speaking of a distant cousin. Yes, but these things happen, another would reply, already weighing potatoes in a brown paper bag. Lucien listened, without interrupting. The story had settled now, smooth and simple, heart failure in a man who had lived too long alone. Nothing more, nothing to disturb the town's sleep. He continued his daily walks through the narrow streets. His presence had become part of the scenery, like the fountain or the stone steps leading to the church. He greeted people with a nod, sometimes a small smile, and received the same in return. Once, on a crisp morning, he passed the schoolyard. Children ran in circles, their laughter echoing against the walls. A small boy stood apart, spinning a stick in the dirt. When he saw Lucien, he hesitated, then raised a hand in a tentative wave. Lucien lifted his hat in acknowledgement. He could not remember the boy's name, but he recalled the day he had seen him loitering near the tower after Vasseur's death. The boy had known something then, or perhaps felt it in the way children do, before the world teaches them how to forget. Now the boy was laughing with the others, his stick abandoned. Whatever shadow had touched him seemed to have drifted away. Yet the clock tower itself had changed, though no one had altered its structure. It stood, as it always had, square and weathered against the sky, but it had lost the quality of attention. Before, people glanced at it as they passed, sometimes quickly, sometimes with curiosity, sometimes with a trace of guilt. Now they barely saw it. The town council had ordered the door locked, a thin chain secured the handle, and a sign warned against entry. Ivy had begun to creep up the lower stones, and dead leaves gathered in the crevices of the steps. One evening, Lucien paused at the base of the tower. He placed his hand against the cold stone. No one else was there. He thought of Vasseur's room inside, dust settling over a lifetime of quiet habits, the small bed, the tin cup, the stack of letters no one had claimed. He wondered if the man had sensed, in his final hours, that the world outside had already erased him. Lucien's hand lingered for a moment, then he turned and walked away. By mid-October, the town prepared for All Saints' Day. Chrysanthemums filled the florist's window. The air smelled of damp leaves and early frost. Lucien visited the cemetery one morning, though not because he felt compelled to. His habits led him there, the way water follows the line of least resistance. He found Vasseur's grave near the edge, a modest stone with a small brass plaque. It bore only his name and the years of his life. Someone had left a single white flower, already beginning to curl at the edges. Lucien stood for a while, hands clasped behind his back, listening to the crows in the trees. He did not pray, he rarely did, but he let the silence stretch, and in that silence he felt the weight of everything left unsaid. In the café that afternoon, Jeanne brought his coffee with her usual soft smile. The place was warm, filled with the smell of baked bread. Rain had begun to fall outside, blurring the square into a muted watercolor. "You've been quiet lately," she said, settling the cup in front of him. Lucien glanced up. "Have I?" "Yes. Not that you were ever talkative." She hesitated, leaning a little closer. "Do you ever think about him? About the old man?" Lucien stirred his coffee. "Sometimes." "I do too," she said. Her eyes flicked to the window, then back. "But it feels, far away now, doesn't it?" "Yes," Lucien said. "Far away." Jean smiled faintly, though it was the kind of smile people wear when they are closing a door in their own minds. She returned to her work, and the hum of conversation in the café rose and fell around him. As winter approached, the river grew slower, heavier with rain. Nights came early. The town's windows glowed against the darkness, and smoke curled from chimneys in thin silver threads. Lucien walked home one evening along the deserted streets. A dog barked somewhere, then went silent. He passed the tower without pausing this time. Its windows reflected no light. It was not a place of memory anymore. It had become simply part of the landscape, stripped of story. He thought briefly about the truth he carried, not the facts, which were simple enough, but the quiet knowledge of how a man could die twice, once in the body, once in the slow erasure of belonging. The town had delivered the second death long before the first arrived. Lucien knew he would carry that awareness not as guilt, but as a permanent shadow at the edge of his days, a reminder that the world preferred its silences neat, its endings plausible, its consciences untroubled. By Christmas, the market was strung with lights. Children pressed their noses to the baker's window, pointing at sugared cakes and chocolate bells. Snow fell one night, softening the roofs and turning the square into a quiet painting. Lucien stood at his window, watching the flakes drift under the street lamp. He thought of the year that had passed, of the empty room in the tower, of the unspoken agreement that had settled over Saint-Aubin like the snow itself. Life had moved on, and he had moved with it, step by deliberate step, as though he were following a path laid out in the frost. The past had become a private country, visited only in silence. When spring returned, the ivy on the clock tower had climbed another few feet. Birds nested under the eaves. Tourists stopped sometimes to take a photograph, unaware of what had transpired inside. To them it was just an old building in a quiet French town. Lucien, standing on the edge of the square, watched them for a moment, then turned away. He had grown used to the rhythm of forgetting. The world did not want the truth, and he no longer felt the need to offer it. The aftermath was not loud, not dramatic. It was the quiet settling of dust, the slow weaving of ordinary life over a tear in the fabric. In Saint-Aubin, the past had become something softer than memory, and Lucienne had learned to live inside it. The years rolled over Saint-Aubin like a slow tide, leaving the town both unchanged and subtly weathered. Children who had once run through the square with sticks and marbles now carried books to school or sat behind counters in their parents' shops. The market stalls saw new hands, but the same apples and pears, the same talk about rain and sun. Lucien aged with the town. His walks became slower, his posture more stooped. Yet he kept to his routine. The morning stroll to the bakery, the quiet hour in the cafe, the evening circuit past the river and the old clock tower. The tower itself had become part of the scenery, swallowed by ivy on its lower walls, its stones darkened by moss and rain. Most newcomers to the town never learned its story. To them it was simply a relic, a backdrop for photographs and lazy Sunday walks. The locals rarely spoke of Vasseur anymore. Time had filed the memory down to a smooth, polite shape. An old man had died. Life had gone on. One early spring afternoon, Lucienne sat on a bench beneath the bare branches of the chestnut trees by the square. A young man approached carrying a leather satchel. He had the restless energy of someone from elsewhere, his coat too urban for the slow air of Saint-Aubin. "Excuse me," the young man said. "Are you Monsieur Lucien?" Lucien nodded, a little surprised. "I'm writing a small piece for the regional paper," the man continued. "A series on local history. People told me. You might know stories about the old tower, for instance. I heard there was a mystery there once." Lucien studied the boyish face before him. He could see that spark of curiosity, the hunger for something dramatic. It was the same spark he had seen in children long ago, before the town taught them how to lower their voices. "Sit," Lucien said finally, patting the bench beside him. The young man opened his notebook, but Lucien spoke slowly, as if unspooling a memory he had not touched in years. "There was an old man," he began, "lived alone in the tower. His name was Vasseur, quiet man. He had habits. Every morning he walked to the market for bread and milk. Every evening he wound the clock." The young man leaned forward. "And he was killed?" Lucien hesitated. He could hear the market in the distance, the faint bell from the church, the whisper of the wind against stone. "No," Lucien said. "Not killed. He died. That's all anyone ever wrote down." The reporter's pen hovered over the page. "But people used to talk, didn't they? About something strange?" Lucien's gaze drifted to the tower, rising above the rooftops like a mute witness. A soft melancholy settled over him, the same that had followed him for decades. "Yes," he said finally. There was talk, because small towns don't know what to do with loneliness. When someone like Vasseur dies, people look for a reason, they whisper. They imagine shadows where there were only empty rooms. The young man frowned slightly, sensing something withheld. "And you? You were here then. You must have seen things." Lucien's fingers traced the worn wood of the bench. He thought of Vasseur's narrow bed, the dust in the corners, the letters tied with string, the quiet shame that had hovered over him like a permanent winter. He thought of the way the town had let the man die long before he stopped breathing. "I saw a man who was tired," Lucien said softly. "Tired of waiting for someone to knock on his door. Tired of living as though he were already a ghost." The young man scribbled a few words, unsatisfied. "So, no crime?" Lucien almost smiled. He felt the old reflex, to hold the truth in his chest like a bird too fragile to release. But time had softened the edges of secrecy. The truth no longer belonged to anyone who could be hurt by it. There was no crime the law could see, Lucienne said. But there are other kinds of crimes, the ones we commit by doing nothing, by looking away. The reporter's pen slowed. He glanced up, unsure how to frame silence as a story. So, you think the town was guilty? Lucienne shook his head gently. Number just human. They sat for a while without speaking. The square hummed with quiet life. A bicycle bell, the clink of glasses from the cafe terrace, the faint scrape of a broom on stone. You know, Lucienne said at last, I used to think that telling the truth would matter, that it would change something, but time has its own way of covering things like snow or dust. People prefer their lives neat. They need their nights to be quiet. The young man closed his notebook slowly, sensing that whatever he had come for was not what he would take away. Thank you, monsieur. I think I understand. No, Lucienne murmured, but that's all right. You will, one day. But that evening, Lucienne walked past the clock tower. A soft light of sunset touched the ivy, turning the stones gold for a moment before they sank back into shadow. He paused, letting the cool air settle in his lungs. The truth, he thought, was like the tower itself. It stood whether anyone chose to see it or not. The years had not changed what had happened, nor the quiet complicity of those who had lived alongside it. He felt no bitterness now, only the steady weight of understanding. As he turned to leave, he whispered something, not a name, not a prayer, just a fragment of acknowledgement carried off by the wind. Then he walked back into the town, into the life that would continue without him one day, leaving the tower to keep its own counsel. The past had folded into the present, soft and nearly silent. Saint-Aubin would wake tomorrow as it always had, and the old clock tower would watch without judgment, holding the last truth in its stones, long after the last man who remembered it was gone.